What if I told you that the deadliest weapon in modern warfare isn't a stealth bomber or a hypersonic missile? What if I told you it's a secret, hidden in plain sight, in one of the poorest countries on Earth? A secret so powerful, it caused a NATO general to publicly humiliate a world leader, only to later dedicate a secret working group to desperately try and understand it. This is a story about a nation that was supposed to collapse. A nation written off by the world, bleeding from 1,000 cuts, left to be devoured by some of the most brutal terrorist groups on the planet. Western intelligence agencies gave it months. They were preparing the eulogy. But then, something happened. The insurgents, who had filmed their atrocities and paraded their victories, suddenly went silent. Their most feared commanders began disappearing. Entire columns of battle-hardened fighters would enter a region and simply vanish from the face of the earth. No trace, no witnesses, no survivors. It wasn't a conventional war. There were no battle lines. This was something else, something terrifying. What did President Ibrahim Traoré know that the rest of the world didn't? What is the fifth-generation warfare doctrine that he unleashed? A doctrine that allegedly turned every farmer, every herder, every child into a potential censor and a potential weapon. How did they build a nation that is said to be unoccupiable? A place where an invading army cannot find a target, because the society itself becomes a living, breathing, hostile organism. In this video, we will deconstruct the Traoré doctrine. We'll expose the controversial decision to slash the conventional military by 40% in the middle of a war, a move his own generals called suicide. We will reveal the story of the first brutal test of this doctrine, a battle so strange and one-sided it was first dismissed by the CIA as a statistical impossibility. And most importantly, we will uncover why the world's superpowers went from mocking this African nation to secretly trying to copy its methods. This isn't just a story about a war. It's a story about a fundamental shift in the nature of power itself. Stick with us to the end, because the secret we're about to reveal doesn't just explain how to win a war. It might just explain how to survive the 21st century. Subscribe for more video. The air in the Brussels Defense Summit was thick, heavy with the scent of old leather, polished wood, and unwavering certainty. It was a cathedral of conviction, where the religion was military doctrine and the gods were aircraft carriers and main battle tanks. In this hall, power wasn't just understood, it was displayed, worn on the crisp uniforms of generals whose chests glittered with the medals of past, predictable wars. And among these titans, none was more revered than NATO General Richard Harrington. He was a man forged in the crucible of conventional warfare, a living monument to the logic of overwhelming force. His voice, a low baritone accustomed to command, carried the weight of an unshakable orthodoxy. Victory belonged to the side with the bigger guns. It was during a lull between panels, a brief moment of diplomatic maneuvering over coffee and canapés, that Harrington spotted his target. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Younger than most leaders in the room by 2 decades, Traoré possessed a stillness that seemed out of place amidst the restless ambition surrounding him. His uniform was sharp but unadorned, his presence defined not by an aura of command, but by an unnerving sense of observation. With the practiced ease of a man who owned any room he entered, Harrington steered the young African leader aside, a hand resting momentarily on his shoulder in a gesture that was half welcome, half assertion of dominance. "A fascinating little theory you have, Mr. President." Truly, Harrington began, his voice laced with the confident condescension reserved for promising students and strategically unimportant nations. This idea of a decentralized, community-based defense. It's intellectually stimulating. He paused, letting the faint praise hang in the air before delivering the checkmate. But let's be blunt. Let's talk about reality, not theory. What happens when a column of my M1 Abrams tanks rolls across your border? When my F-35s own your sky? What will your distributed network do then? Throw spears at them? A ripple of knowing smirks and subtle nods passed through the nearby circle of Western military attachés. It was a classic rhetorical kill shot, designed to gently but firmly put the upstart leader back in his place, reminding him of the unassailable truth of steel and high explosives. The game was rigged, and they owned the casino. But Ibrahim Traoré did not look chastened. He didn't rush to defend himself. Instead, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He held the general's gaze for a long moment, his calm a stark contrast to the barely concealed dismissiveness of the group. "General," Traoré said, his voice quiet yet carrying an edge of precision that cut through the ambient noise. "The flaw in your question is that you are asking a third-generation question about a fifth-generation reality." Harrington's eyebrows knitted together for a fraction of a second. "Fifth generation?" "Yes," Traoré affirmed. "It means we are not building an army to defeat an invasion. We are building a nation that cannot be invaded. A society that is impossible to occupy because an invader cannot distinguish the target from the terrain, the fighter from the farmer. You ask what our network will do against your tanks. The real question is, what will your tanks do when they can no longer find a battlefield? When the very society they are entering becomes the weapon." General Harrington chuckled. It was a deep, dismissive sound. He gave Traoré a final, fatherly pat on the shoulder. "A beautiful sentiment, Mr. President. Truly." He turned away, moving on to his next conversation, filing the exchange away as the charming, philosophical idealism of an outmatched leader trying to make a virtue of his own weakness. The moment was forgotten, a mere footnote in a day of serious discussions about cyber warfare and force projection. But it wasn't forgotten by everyone. For the few who had listened closely, Traoré's words were not an admission of weakness, but a declaration of a different kind of strength. It was a question the general would spend the rest of his career trying to answer. For in that brief, dismissed exchange, the playbook for 21st-century warfare had just been rewritten. The West, in all its certainty, just hadn't realized it yet. To understand the doctrine that so baffled General Harrington, one cannot remain in the polished corridors of Brussels. One must travel thousands of miles south, leaving the world of predictable power dynamics behind, and land in the red dust of Ouagadougou. Here, the air itself tells a different story. It is a story carried on the harmattan wind, a fine grit that settles on everything, a constant reminder of the encroaching Sahel. It is a story told in the scent of diesel fumes, charcoal fires, and a pervasive, underlying anxiety. This was the nation Ibrahim Traoré inherited, and it was a nation not on the brink, but already falling. Burkina Faso was a country bleeding from 1,000 cuts. It wasn't a single war, but a tapestry of overlapping insurgencies, a chaotic insurgency that defied maps and frontlines. Extremist groups, bandit networks, and ethnic militias moved like wraiths through the vast, arid landscapes. They were a cancer that metastasized in the poorest regions, feeding on instability. The nation's borders were phantom lines drawn on colonial maps a century earlier, meaningless to the smugglers and fighters who crossed them as easily as the wind. The national army, though brave, was a shadow of what was needed. It was an institution trained by Western partners to fight a conventional war that did not exist, equipped to defend fixed points in a conflict that was fluid and everywhere. For years, the prescription from the international community had been the same: more funding, more high-tech equipment, more foreign training missions. It was an expensive and soul-crushing cycle. Each shipment of armored vehicles created a new, high-value target for insurgent attacks. Each new battalion trained in conventional tactics was deployed to a region, only for the violence to simply flow around it, popping up somewhere else like a grim game of whack-a-mole. This approach didn't build security, it created dependency. It taught Burkina Faso to fight someone else's war, with someone else's tools, and to fail, again and again. It was in a modest, sun-bleached government building, in a room cooled by a single, rattling air conditioner, that Traoré convened his new National Security Council. The faces around the table were etched with a decade of frustration. They were career soldiers, seasoned intelligence chiefs, and lifelong civil servants. They expected to hear another plea for international aid, another strategy for reshuffling their dwindling resources. They were prepared for a speech about resilience and sacrifice. They were not prepared for what they heard instead. Traoré stood before them, not behind a lectern, but at the head of the table, as one of them. For 10 years, he began, his voice low and even, we have fought their war on their terms. We have built walls, and they have walked through them. We have created strongpoints, and they have flowed around them. We have treated this threat as an invading army, but it is not an army. It is a sickness in the water. And you do not fight a sickness with a hammer. He let the words settle. Our partners in the West urge us to spend what little we have on more tanks, more aircraft. To what end? To guard patches of desert while our villages burn? To bankrupt our children's future in service of a military doctrine from the last century? This has failed. Repeatedly. We must have the courage to admit that. He paused, looking each person in the eye. Our greatest vulnerability is not our lack of tanks. It is our imagination. It is our conceptual framework, which sees security as something the state provides to a passive population. This framework is broken. A heavy silence filled the room. It was finally broken by General Diallo, the venerable defense minister, a man who had been trained in the finest French military academies. He leaned forward, his expression a mixture of respect and profound skepticism. What alternative, then, do you propose, Mr. President? If not with an army, how do we defend the nation? Traoré's posture softened. The intensity gave way to the focus of a teacher. We will stop trying to be the fist that smashes the hornet's nest. Instead, we will become the sand. Everywhere and nowhere at once. You cannot punch sand, General. You can only sink into it. Every farmer who knows the new face in his village, he continued, every herder who notices a strange track in the dust, every market vendor who overhears a whisper. There are new frontline sensors. There our network. Our army will no longer be a blunt instrument trying to hold territory. It will become a surgeon's scalpel, guided with lethal precision by the nervous system of the entire nation. We will not build walls. We will build a web. A distributed architecture of defense, embedded in the very fabric of our society. The council was silent, stunned. It was an idea born not of strategy manuals, but of pure, desperate necessity. It was audacious. It was poetic. To some in the room, it sounded like madness. But for a nation with nothing left to lose, madness was starting to look like the only rational path forward. The question was no longer if they should try something new, but how on earth they could build such a thing from the ground up. The weeks following that fateful Security Council meeting were a blur of radical reinvention. Ouagadougou became an unlikely epicenter for a quiet revolution, not of politics but of thought. Traoré's vision was to dismantle the very concept of a centralized state security apparatus and rebuild it from the soil up. To do this, he knew he couldn't rely solely on the men in the room who had spent their lives thinking about battle lines and kill ratios. His team became an eclectic, almost bizarre assembly. Alongside grizzled military officers, he brought in anthropologists who understood the ancient social codes of remote villages, network theorists who mapped data flows, community organizers who knew how to build trust where there was none, and even traditional village elders, the living repositories of ancestral knowledge. Their mandate was revolutionary. Don't make our army stronger. Make our society unbreakable. The framework that emerged, known internally as the Distributed Defense Network, was built on 5 pillars that directly contradicted a century of Western military doctrine. It was a complete inversion of conventional logic. First, security would no longer be defined by force projection but by social cohesion. The strength of the nation wasn't in its ability to launch an attack, but in the unbreakable bonds between its people. A village where neighbors trusted each other, shared information, and felt a common sense of identity was, in this new doctrine, a more powerful fortress than any concrete bunker. Second, defense capability had to be distributed, not concentrated. Traoré argued that concentrating your best troops and equipment in a military base created a single, high-value target. It was a brittle strategy. Instead, basic defense capabilities, observation, communication, immediate response, would be woven into the fabric of hundreds of communities. The system was designed to be resilient, like a spider's web. You could break a single thread, but the entire structure would hold, absorbing the shock and transmitting information about the damage instantly. Third, information superiority would be achieved through community integration, not expensive technological surveillance. A drone could see a truck moving through the desert, but it couldn't know if that truck belonged to a local merchant or a foreign fighter. A farmer, however, knew the sound of every engine in his valley. A herder could read the story of a dozen men passing in the night from the disturbed earth. This deep, granular, human-centric data was priceless. The challenge was to build secure, trusted channels to collect this information and feed it to regional command centers without endangering the source. Fourth, territorial control was redefined as legitimacy, not occupation. The army would no longer be seen as an occupying force sent from the capital. The new strategy focused on winning hearts and minds in the most literal sense. Instead of building military outposts, the government began establishing community resilience centers. These were hybrid facilities. A single compound might contain a small, secure armory and a rapid response team, but it would also house a medical clinic, a grain storage silo, a marketplace, and a school. The message was clear. Security and prosperity are two sides of the same coin. The state wasn't just there to kill enemies, it was there to ensure a better life. This made the community a willing partner, not a passive subject. Finally, and most controversially, Traoré made his biggest gamble. He announced a staggering 40% cut to the conventional military budget over 2 years. The outrage was instantaneous and visceral. Generals who had dedicated their lives to the army saw it as a betrayal, a suicidal act of disarmament. In a tense, heated meeting with his senior officers, Traoré stood firm. "We are not abandoning defense," he explained, his voice cutting through the fury. "We are redefining it. Your most sophisticated rifle is useless if you are blind. The largest army cannot hold ground if the people on that ground see it as an enemy. I am not taking away your swords. I am giving you 1,000,000 eyes and ears to guide them." The plan was set. The resources were redirected. Across the country, in pilot regions facing the most intense threats, this radical blueprint began its slow, difficult transformation into reality. To the outside world, it looked like Burkina Faso was unilaterally disarming in the middle of a war. To the insurgents, it looked like a golden opportunity, a sign of weakness and collapse. To Traoré and his small band of believers, it was the only move they had left. The blueprint was drawn. Now, it had to survive contact with reality. The first 6 months were a quiet agony. The transition was not clean, the results not immediate. In some pilot regions, there was a fragile, hopeful peace. In others, the violence continued, seemingly unabated. The redirected funds were slow to manifest as clinics and schools, and the old guard of the military simmered with resentment, their warnings of catastrophe echoing in the halls of power. From Washington and Paris, the analysis was swift and damning. Influential think tanks published white papers with condescending titles like Burkina Faso's Security Theater and The Idealist's Gambit. The consensus was clear. Traoré was a naive dreamer whose philosophical experiment was leading his country to ruin. The insurgents were reading the same reports. Their intelligence, gathered from a network of informants and sympathizers, painted a picture of opportunity. They saw a conventional army in retreat, its budget slashed, its morale broken. They saw new, undefended, soft targets, in the form of community centers. They saw a government chasing ghosts and abandoning the hard realities of war. The leader of the most powerful insurgent group, a ruthless warlord named Omar al-Fulani, saw his moment. He would not just raid a village. He would deliver a blow so decisive it would shatter the government's credibility and prove the foolishness of Traoré's doctrine for all to see. He assembled a force of over 300 veteran fighters, a formidable column of technicals mounted with heavy machine guns and battle-hardened men who knew the terrain like the back of their hands. Their target was the province of Udalin, a region where the military's footprint had been deliberately reduced to almost nothing, replaced by one of the flagship community resilience centers. To al-Fulani, it was the perfect target, symbolically important and, by all conventional metrics, utterly defenseless. The attack was planned with classic military precision. A three-pronged assault at dawn to overwhelm the region before any meaningful response could be mounted from the capital. As the first column of trucks roared across the scrubland in the pre-dawn gloom, however, something felt wrong. The land was too quiet. The villages they passed were not asleep, they were empty. There were no lights, no panicked civilians fleeing into the bush. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the people. Al-Fulani's commanders pressed on, dismissing it as fear. They didn't know that their approach had been silently logged 3 hours earlier by a nomadic herder camped on a high ridge, who relayed their position and heading with a simple, coded message on a cheap, shortwave radio. That message was not sent to a distant, bureaucratic headquarters in Ouagadougou. It was relayed to the regional coordination hub, the nerve center of the local network. By the time the insurgents reached their primary targets, the trap was sprung. But there was no front line, no army to fight. When they attacked the resilience center, they found it defended not by a platoon of soldiers, but by a small, ferociously determined local defense unit that used their intimate knowledge of the compound to inflict casualties and then melt away into prepared positions. When the second column tried to secure a key crossroads, Their path was blocked by felled trees and makeshift traps they hadn't seen in the dark. Their movements seemed sluggish, anticipated. The desert, which should have been their ally, had become a hall of mirrors. Then came the scalpel. Guided by real-time intelligence from a web of unseen observers, small, elite quick-reaction forces, the surgical instrument of the new army, struck not the main body of the insurgent force, but its veins. A small team on motorbikes ambushed their fuel truck miles behind the main advance. Another team, using a sniper rifle from a kilometer away, eliminated the commanders of the third column as they stopped to read a map. The silence on Al-Fulani's radio wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. His force was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. He couldn't find a target to hit, an army to fight. He was swinging a sledgehammer in a room full of smoke. The doctrine wasn't just a strategy, it was a living, breathing organism, and his invasion had triggered its immune response. Within 7 hours, it was over. The coordinated attack had devolved into a panicked rout. The surviving insurgents fled back across the border, leaderless and broken, harassed every step of the way by local militias who seemed to rise from the very dust. The result was a victory more decisive than any the old army had ever achieved. Casualties on the government and civilian side were minimal. The insurgent force had been functionally annihilated. It was a victory won not with firepower, but with information. Not with occupation, but with integration. Not with force, but with cohesion. The news of the Battle of Udalin spread first as a rumor, then as a confirmed report that sent shockwaves through the region. In the think tanks of the West, there was stunned silence. In the halls of NATO, a few curious analysts began to quietly pull up the file on the idealistic president of Burkina Faso. The doctrine was no longer a theory. It was no longer security theater. It had been tested by fire, and it had held. The world, which had been so quick to dismiss it, was about to start paying very close attention. The victory at Udalin was more than a successful battle, it was a paradigm shift made real. The event acted like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples began to spread, first across Burkina Faso, and then far beyond its borders. Internally, the change was palpable. The simmering resentment within the military quieted, replaced by a grudging respect and, among the younger officers, a fervent enthusiasm. They had seen the doctrine work. They had seen the scalpel cut with devastating precision. The 40% budget cut was no longer viewed as a betrayal, but as a strategic reallocation that had paid off spectacularly. Implementation, once a slow and cautious process, now accelerated with newfound conviction. Communities that were once hesitant to participate now demanded their own resilience centers, eager to become nodes in this new national defense network. Internationally, the reaction was a slow, fascinating turn from dismissal to curiosity, then to intense, almost obsessive, study. The initial reports were met with disbelief. Security experts, accustomed to analyzing conflicts through the lens of force ratios and weapons systems, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Their models had no variables for social cohesion or herder-based intelligence networks. One early, leaked cable from a Western embassy described the battle's outcome as a statistical anomaly, attributing it to insurgent incompetence rather than government strategy. But anomalies, when they repeat, become patterns. As Burkina Faso's security metrics began to improve dramatically, terrorist incidents down, community confidence up, the anomaly explanation became untenable. Delegations began to arrive in Ouagadougou. These were not the high-level diplomatic visits of before, but quiet, discreet teams of seasoned intelligence analysts, counterinsurgency specialists, and military strategists. They came in expecting to find a clever trick, a secret weapon, or a hidden benefactor. They left disoriented and deeply unsettled. A now famous confidential report from a visiting British defense analyst captured the shared confusion. The most disorienting aspect of the Burkinabe system, he wrote, is that you cannot find its edges. We ask to see their security infrastructure, and they show us a grain market. We ask to meet their intelligence officers, and we are introduced to a council of village elders. The security system doesn't exist as a separate entity. It is embedded in everything, in their economy, their social structures, their communication habits. It's a ghost. It's everywhere and nowhere. And frankly, we have no idea how one would even begin to fight it. This very quality, The deliberate blurring of lines between civilian life and security functions was what made the Traoré doctrine so revolutionary. It challenged the most fundamental assumption of modern statehood, the state's monopoly on violence. Here, security was not a monopoly, it was a commons, cultivated and managed by the people themselves. The ultimate symbol of this global shift came 3 years after that fateful encounter in Brussels. General Richard Harrington, the man who had so condescendingly dismissed Traoré's beautiful sentiment, found himself in a new, unexpected position. In a closed-door session at NATO headquarters, a special working group was formed. Its official mandate was to study the implications of non-conventional, societal-based defense architectures on alliance security strategies. Its informal name was the Traoré Doctrine Working Group, and its appointed chairman, to his own profound astonishment, was General Harrington himself. The dismissive skeptic had become the doctrine's designated student. The ripples continued to spread. In neighboring Mali and Niger, nations facing the same relentless tide of insurgency, leaders began to see a glimmer of hope. They had been trapped in the same cycle of dependency and failure as Burkina Faso. Now, they saw a path out. Cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, they began implementing their own contextualized versions of the framework, adapting its principles to their unique cultural and geographic landscapes. The doctrine was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming an export. The idea, born of desperation in one of the world's poorest countries, was starting its improbable journey onto the world stage, forcing the world's most powerful military minds to unlearn everything they thought they knew about war. The story of the Traoré doctrine could have ended there, as a brilliant but niche counter-insurgency strategy. It could have been relegated to military academies as a fascinating case study in asymmetric warfare. But its principles were too fundamental, too powerful, to be contained within the narrow confines of defense. As the years unfolded into decades, what began as a method for fighting insurgents evolved into a comprehensive philosophy for building resilient societies, capable of withstanding not just human threats, but any systemic shock. The first great leap in understanding came with Traoré's articulation of unoccupiable space. During a rare interview with an international security journal 10 years after the doctrine's implementation, he was asked if his system could withstand a conventional invasion from a major power. His answer redefined the entire concept of national defense. "You are still thinking in terms of occupation," he explained. "An occupying force needs targets. It needs to seize infrastructure, neutralize command centers, and control a population. Our doctrine eliminates those targets. Where is the command center? It is in 1,000 different conversations. Where is the infrastructure? It is in the trust between neighbors. Where is the army? It is in the collective will of the people. You cannot occupy a society that refuses to present itself as a target. An adversary cannot defeat what they cannot locate, and they cannot control what they cannot understand. This is the essence of building an unoccupiable space." This idea was a conceptual earthquake. It suggested that a nation's ultimate defense wasn't its military might, but the very complexity and cohesion of its social fabric. The doctrine wasn't just a shield, it was a form of strategic camouflage on a national scale. As the world lurched through the cascading crises of the 21st century, the doctrine's applications multiplied in ways its creators had never imagined. When a devastating wave of organized crime threatened to overwhelm urban centers in parts of Latin America, security architects there adapted the principles. They established resilience hubs in favelas, integrating community policing with social services, job training, and local governance, turning neighborhoods that were once breeding grounds for gangs into hostile environments for them. Then came the climate crisis. As catastrophic floods and droughts began to displace millions, nations realized their centralized disaster response agencies were too slow, too brittle. Again, they turned to the Traoré doctrine. Communities in vulnerable coastal regions in Southeast Asia developed distributed early warning systems based on local ecological knowledge. They created decentralized networks for food and water storage and established local response teams, making them far less dependent on slow-moving government aid. The framework designed to resist an invading army proved equally effective at resisting a rising sea. The ultimate test, however, came with the COVID-19 pandemic. The global crisis laid bare the fragility of even the world's wealthiest nations. Centralized healthcare systems buckled, supply chains shattered, and top-down government mandates met with widespread resistance. Yet, a remarkable pattern emerged. Nations and regions that had, for other reasons, adopted principles of distributed resilience fared significantly better. Their integrated community networks were able to disseminate trusted information, organize mutual aid for the vulnerable, and maintain essential functions even when official institutions were overwhelmed. They demonstrated that the same social cohesion that could defeat an insurgent could also defeat a virus. Security, it turned out, was indivisible. Over the span of 25 years, the world watched as an idea from Burkina Faso became a global paradigm. International conferences, once held in Brussels or Geneva to discuss billion-dollar weapon systems, were now being hosted in Ouagadougou to discuss methodologies for community integration. The Global Institute for Fifth-Generation Security was established, its mission not to export a model, but to facilitate its adaptation. The doctrine had proven it wasn't just about fighting wars. It was about survival. It was a blueprint for how a society could hold itself together in an age of unprecedented disruption, a recognition that the strongest defense against chaos, in any form, was a deeply connected, self-aware, and resilient populace. The battlefield had expanded from the Sahel to encompass the entire human experience. The passage of time has a way of turning revolutions into conventional wisdom. 50, then 75, then 100 years after Ibrahim Traoré's tense exchange in Brussels, the principles he articulated had become so foundational to global security and governance that they were no longer seen as radical. They were simply seen as true. The concept of building a defense system isolated from the society it protected seemed as antiquated as charging cavalry into machine gun fire. The world had not merely adopted the Traoré doctrine, it had been fundamentally reshaped by it. The most profound legacy was the complete inversion of the global power dynamic. For centuries, the story of power was a story of wealth and military hardware. A nation's influence was measured by its GDP and the number of aircraft carriers it could deploy. The Traoré doctrine rewrote that equation. It demonstrated, with decades of irrefutable data, that a small, resource-limited nation with high social cohesion and a distributed, adaptive infrastructure was exponentially more resilient, and therefore more secure, than a wealthy, powerful nation plagued by internal division and reliant on brittle, centralized systems. This had a transformative effect on international relations. The Global South, once seen as a collection of security consumers, dependent on the aid and intervention of the Global North, became a wellspring of security innovation. The annual African Security Summit in Ouagadougou, held in a sprawling international complex that seamlessly blended advanced technology with open-air markets and community gardens, became the world's most influential forum on resilience and defense. Leaders and theorists from every continent flocked there not to offer aid, but to learn. The language of power itself changed. The focus shifted from force projection to system resilience, from technological dominance to socio-technical integration. Military academies, which once taught cadets to command armies, now taught them how to facilitate community resilience. The highest mark of a successful officer was not a victorious battle, but a community that no longer needed their direct protection. This evolution culminated in a world that was, in many ways, safer, not because weapons had been eliminated, but because the very logic of conquest had been made obsolete in many regions. Why invade a nation when there is nothing to conquer? How do you occupy a people whose defensive strength is woven into the very fabric of their daily lives? The concept of unoccupiable space had become a reality, a powerful deterrent that had nothing to do with nuclear arsenals. 100 years after the first implementation, at a centennial summit connecting delegates across the globe, the keynote address was delivered not by a general or a president, but by the director of the Global Resilience Institute, the intellectual successor to Ibrahim Traoré's original team. Her final words, broadcast from the very site in northern Burkina Faso where the first community resilience center was built, served as the ultimate epitaph for the revolution. For generations, she said, her voice echoing across continents and even to orbital habitats, humanity sought security in the strength of its walls and the sharpness of its swords. We believed protection was a service provided by the powerful to the passive. The greatest insight of the last century, born right here in this dust, is that this was a profound mistake. True, lasting security is not a service to be provided. It is an emergent property of a well-built society. It emerges not from overwhelming force, but from distributed complexity. Not from resource abundance, but from creative adaptation. The ultimate lesson of the Traoré doctrine is not about how to fight a war. It is about how to build a world where such wars are conceptually futile. It teaches us that the most decisive question a leader can ask is not, "How powerful are my forces?" but, "How connected are my people?" Because effective protection, we have finally learned, depends not on the army you can deploy, but on the society you can build. In that final, simple truth lay the doctrine's enduring legacy. It was a legacy written not in the annals of war, but in the peaceful, vibrant, and resilient communities that now span the globe. The living proof that the greatest strength of any nation is, and always has been, its people.